At precisely 05:47 a.m. on June 12, 1942, the dust of 1,000 gravel roads seemed to settle on the worn cloth suitcase of Dorothy Erickson. She stepped off the bus in Des Moines, Iowa, a 19-year-old girl whose world, until that very moment, had been measured in the rhythmic clinking of milk pails and the predictable cycle of the corn harvest. The air in the city didn't smell like the sweet, damp earth of her father's farm. It smelled of diesel exhaust, hot asphalt, and an electric underlying current of urgency that she couldn't yet name. Behind her, disappearing into the pre-dawn haze, were the only things she truly knew. 60 miles of rolling plains and a family who had watched their sons vanish into the maw of a global cataclysm. Dorothy stood on the sidewalk, a small figure in a vast, shifting landscape, unaware that in exactly 4 months, her hands that currently shook with a mixture of fear and cold, would load more ammunition in a single 10-hour shift than her grandfather had fired in his entire life during the Great War. She was a farm girl, a daughter of the soil, but the soil was no longer enough. The world was screaming for steel and lead. As Dorothy gripped her suitcase, 4,000 miles to the east, the German panzer divisions were tearing through the Russian steppes like a hot knife through tallow, their sights set on the Volga. To the west, the rising sun of Japan cast a long, dark shadow across the Pacific, stretching from the jungles of Burma to the remote outposts of the Marshall Islands. The Allied cause was a bleeding wound. In Washington, the halls of the War Department were filled with men staring at maps that looked like death sentences. They faced a logistical nightmare that defied history. How do you arm 12 million men when the heartbeat of your factories cannot match the rhythm of the dying on the front lines? America didn't just need bullets. It needed a miracle of production. Not millions, not hundreds of millions, billions. And it needed them before the winter snows of 1942 choked the supply lines. Before we go deeper into the secret city that rose from the Iowa mud, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to the voices that history tried to bury. The stories of ordinary hands that held the fate of the world. The Des Moines Ordnance Plant was a ghost in 1941, merely 127 acres of flat, featureless farmland. It was chosen for its isolation, its safety in the deep, landlocked heart of the continent. Submarines couldn't touch it, bombers couldn't find it. The military planners knew that if the coasts fell, if the great ports were seized, the heart of America would still be pumping out the lead needed to reclaim the world. Construction had been a violent, frantic birth starting in January. Within 5 months, 24 buildings and 4 million square feet of factory floor had materialized where corn should have been growing. It was a mechanical organism with its own rail lines and a power grid capable of lighting a city of 50,000. And at its core, hidden behind layers of security and silence, was a production line designed for a singular, impossible purpose: to turn raw brass into .30 caliber ammunition at a rate of 9 million rounds per day. Dorothy Erickson, with her farm-calloused hands and her simple cloth suitcase, was about to become the soul of that machine. Dorothy didn't know any of the staggering statistics when she arrived. She only knew that the farm she called home, 60 miles to the northwest, was a place of quiet labor. where the loudest sound was the lowing of cows before sunrise and the heavy slosh of water buckets after dark. Her world had been hollowed out. Her two brothers had enlisted in the first wave of patriotic fever, leaving her father to wrestle with the land alone. He needed her hands on the plow, but the recruiter in town had spoken of a different kind of harvest. He had looked at Dorothy and said the words that changed everything. "The war needs you more." So she came, along with 14,999 other women who had abandoned their kitchens, their schoolrooms, and their family traditions. They were the daughters of the Midwest, stepping into a life they had never imagined. When Dorothy walked toward the hiring office, the air was a chaotic symphony of construction, the bone-shaking grind of concrete mixers, and the blinding shower of sparks from welders fusing unfinished steel. The hiring officer didn't ask about her education or her dreams. He reached out and took her hands, turning them over to inspect the palms. They were calloused, strong, weathered by the brutal winters of Iowa. He nodded, satisfied. To him, she wasn't Dorothy Erickson anymore. She was a biological component of the war effort. He handed her a cold metal badge, Employee 3847, Shift B. Start time, 0600 tomorrow. No safety briefing, no long-winded training. There was no time for the luxury of preparation. As Dorothy walked through the skeleton of what would become Building 114, the small arms loading facility, the sheer scale of it stole the air from her lungs. Rows upon rows of machines she didn't recognize stretched into the gloom, lit only by half-installed bulbs that cast long, predatory shadows. There were massive presses, endless conveyors, and hoppers already filled with brass casings that glinted like gold in the dim light. She was gathered with the other new hires in a space that reeked of wet concrete and pungent cutting oil. Standing before them was a man who looked like he had been forged in a furnace, Carl Benson. At 54, his face was a road map of industrial toil, and 2 fingers were missing from his right hand, a souvenir from a thresher accident years before. He didn't offer a smile or a warm welcome. He simply pointed a scarred hand at a monstrous piece of equipment. "This is a Model 7 progressive loader," he barked. "It takes an empty casing, seats the primer, measures the powder, seats the bullet, and crimps the case. 6 operations, 1 pull. You will do this 1,200 times per hour, every hour, for 8 hours. A girl standing next to Dorothy, her voice trembling, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What if we make a mistake?" Benson stared at her for a long time, his eyes hard as flint. The silence in the hall felt like a physical weight. "You won't," he said. And for the first time, Dorothy realized that in this place, a mistake wasn't just a lost wage. It was a death warrant signed in lead. They started slow. 200 rounds per hour, per operator. The rhythm seemed simple enough. Pull the lever, remove the finished round, inspect the crimp with a fleeting glance, place it in the delivery chute. Pull, remove, inspect, place. But the Model 7 loader was a demanding master. The lever required 40 pounds of brute force to complete its arc. In the first hour, it felt like a workout. By the second hour, the muscles in Dorothy's shoulder began to burn with a low, steady heat. By the fourth hour, the heat had turned into a searing white fire that radiated down her spine. The factory floor was a cacophony of metallic strikes and the rhythmic thud of 10,000 presses, a sound so pervasive it eventually ceased to be noise and became the very air they breathed. No one complained. No one looked up. To the left of Dorothy sat Mary Kowalski, a girl from Cedar Rapids whose eyes were permanently rimmed with red. Mary whispered between the clanks of her machine that her brother was currently ducking sandstorms in North Africa. To Dorothy's right was Irene Halverson, a widow whose son's unit was reportedly running out of ammunition in the starving jungles of the Philippines. This was the invisible thread that bound them to the steel. Every round they produced was a second of life for a boy thousands of miles away. Every round that misfired, every primer seated poorly, was a potential grave. By the end of the first week, Dorothy's body had begun to adapt through sheer, painful necessity. She could now produce 400 rounds per hour without a single conscious thought. By the end of the first month, the number had doubled to 800. Her hands moved faster than her mind could process. Pull, remove, inspect, place. The rhythm had become her heartbeat. The machine had become an extension of her own skeleton. But 800 rounds per hour was a peacetime luxury the world could no longer afford. In late August 1942, a telegram arrived from the War Department, its ink still fresh, its message terrifying. Demand projections revised. The front lines were swallowing lead faster than the earth could provide it. They needed 12 million rounds per day by January. The factory responded with the cold efficiency of a predator. They installed the Model 9 loaders, beasts of automatic feed systems that required a single operator to manage two machines simultaneously. Now, Dorothy was responsible for 1,600 rounds per hour, 12,800 rounds per shift. She learned the impossible art of ambidexterity, loading with her left hand while her right hand performed the micro-inspections that kept men alive. Howard Lumpke, a quiet, ghost-like engineer, watched her for 3 days from the shadows of the catwalk. He didn't offer praise. He only offered more work. He moved her to the high-speed line in Building 114. Here the air tasted of sulfur and hot brass, a thick, metallic soup that coated the back of her throat. Dorothy would tie her hair back with a stained scarf, take her position at Station 14, and disappear into the machine for 8 hours without rest, knowing that every second of hesitation was a second of victory lost to the enemy. At precisely 02:47 p.m., the world inside Building 114 underwent a violent transformation. A low, subterranean vibration shuddered through the concrete floor, followed by a series of dying mechanical wheezes. Then the silence hit. Across the vast factory floor, 200 massive presses fell still. The absence of noise was so sudden and absolute that it felt like physical pressure against Dorothy's eardrums. The air, usually thick with the electric hum of the grid, was now hollow. A voice crackled over the emergency loudspeaker. Power interruption, grid failure, estimated downtime, 90 minutes. 90 minutes. To an outsider, it was a short break. To the women on the line, it was a catastrophe measured in 180,000 missing rounds. Dorothy looked down the row. 5,000 women stood like frozen statues, their hands still hovering over machines that had become useless mounds of steel. The fear in their eyes wasn't for their lost wages. It was for the empty magazines of rifles in North Africa and the Philippines. Falling behind by 90 minutes meant body counts in newspapers 3 weeks later. Names of boys they might recognize from their own hometowns. Howard Lumpke emerged from the shadows of the supervisor's station, his face a mask of grim determination. He wasn't carrying a clipboard. He was lugging a hand-crank loader, a piece of pre-war equipment, obsolete, slow, and heavy. He slammed it onto the steel table in front of Dorothy. "We're not stopping," he said, his voice cutting through the unnatural quiet. It took 12 grueling seconds to load a single round by hand. With the machines, Dorothy could produce 20 per minute. By hand, she could barely manage 5. But 5 was an infinite improvement over 0. She grabbed the crank, her muscles already frayed from the morning shift, screamed as she forced the manual press through its cycle. Next to her, Mary Kowalski followed suit. Then Irene. Within 2 minutes, the sound of the factory had changed from a mechanical roar to a human one, the synchronized grunts of hundreds of women pushing metal against metal with the strength of their own bone and sinew. Their arms burned, their breath came in ragged gasps. Every rotation of the crank was a personal battle against exhaustion. When the power finally surged back 73 minutes later, the machines roared to life like waking predators. Dorothy didn't even pause to wipe the sweat from her eyes. She switched back to the automatic press without losing a single beat. That day, Ligne 7 didn't just meet its quota, they exceeded it. They had lost 73 minutes of electricity, but they clawed back 60 of them by working straight through their dinner break. No one ordered them to do it. No one promised them a bonus. They simply refused to let the war run out of breath on their watch. The winter of 1942 arrived with a predatory fury, the coldest Iowa had seen in 30 years. Temperatures plunged to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the world outside. Building 114 into a jagged wasteland of white and iron. Inside, the situation was little better. The massive boilers, designed for a more merciful climate, groaned and clanked in a futile struggle to push steam through the cavernous factory spaces. Women worked in heavy wool coats, their faces wrapped in scarves like nomads in a blizzard, their breath blooming in the air in thick, crystalline clouds with every exhalation. The machines didn't care about the cold. In fact, they used it as a weapon. The raw brass of the casings conducted the sub-zero temperatures with a malicious efficiency, turning every bullet into a small torch of ice that could burn through industrial gloves in a matter of seconds. Dorothy worked near the north wall, where the Arctic wind found every microscopic gap in the corrugated metal, whistling through the station in freezing streams. By the second hour of her shift, her fingers were no longer hers. They were numb, wooden appendages moving by muscle memory alone. Her brain had ceased to consciously control the motions. It was the machine that pulled her hands through the cycle. The cold did more than freeze the skin. It made the world brittle. Lubricants turned into thick, useless gel. Steel springs, stressed by the thermal contraction, snapped like glass. Maintenance crews, led by a sleep-deprived Howard Lumpke, worked around the clock with bleeding hands to weld cracks that appeared in the frozen presses. On January 8, 1943, the indoor temperature hit 22 degrees. There weren't enough portable heaters to go around, and Dorothy's inspection station had none. Tears would freeze on the women's cheeks before they could fall. And yet, the production logs told a story that defied biology. The numbers were going up. The War Department didn't care about the frostbite. In the ruins of Stalingrad, German and Soviet soldiers were freezing to death in the millions. In North Africa, American boys were shivering in foxholes. Bullets didn't stop working in the cold, and neither could the women who made them. Christmas Day came and went, marked not by trees or carols, but by a dry turkey sandwich in a shivering break room. Dorothy didn't go home. No one did. The buses were frozen, and the trains were reserved for the dying and the soldiers. As her supervisor whispered a quiet, "Merry Christmas," while checking her output, Dorothy realized that for them, the holiday wasn't a day of rest. It was a day of survival. They worked because stopping felt like a betrayal of the boys who had no Christmas at all. In February 1943, the War Department issued a new, terrifying directive: armor-piercing, steel-core rounds. These weren't standard bullets. They were precision instruments of death designed to punch through Japanese bunkers and German tank plating. The tolerances were microscopic, measured in 10,000ths of an inch. A single defect, a primer seated a millimeter too deep, a case crimp 2 degrees off-center, could cause a rifle to explode in a soldier's face, killing the very man the bullet was meant to save. Dorothy was moved to final inspection. It wasn't a promotion. It was a recognition of a strange, almost supernatural gift she had developed. Her hands, once just farm hands, had become as sensitive as a surgeon's. She handled 2,000 rounds per hour, one every 0.8 seconds. She didn't just look at the brass, she felt it. She looked for cracks so small they were invisible to the naked eye, feeling for a subtle resistance in the seating that suggested a weak seal. The weight of it was immense. She knew that every defective round she let pass was a death warrant she was signing. In her first month, she rejected 47 rounds. Industry testing confirmed she was 100% accurate. When asked how she did it, she only said, "I imagine every bullet is going to be fired by my brothers." Then came the afternoon of April 22nd. The shift change was a roar of 5,000 exhausted women transitioning with 5,000 new ones. The plant manager, William Hartley, stepped to the microphone. The hall fell into a silence so heavy you could hear the steam hissing in the pipes. He held a piece of paper, a letter from a B-17 gunner named Robert Hale, stationed in England. Hartley read the words aloud, his voice echoing in the cavernous steel hall. Hale described a hellish 11-minute dogfight over Schweinfurt, where he had fired 3,200 rounds from his ball turret. "Every single one fed smoothly," Hartley read. "Every single one ejected cleanly. Because of you, I'm alive." When he reached the final line, "I wanted you to know that it mattered," something inside Dorothy finally broke. For 10 months, the bullets had been numbers, quotas, abstract pieces of metal. Now they had a name: Robert Hale, 23 years old, Portland, Oregon. He was alive because Dorothy's hands hadn't wavered in the Iowa cold. He was alive because she had refused to be tired. As the 5,000 women began a slow, rhythmic clapping, not a cheer, but a solemn acknowledgement, Dorothy looked at her scarred, oil-stained hands and realized she wasn't just a worker. She was a guardian. The war was no longer something happening on a map. It was a personal promise kept in every grain of gunpowder. By late 1943, the Des Moines Ordnance Plant had become a mechanical miracle that defied the laws of physics and human endurance. They were now producing 9.7 million rounds per day, every single day. It was a number so vast it felt abstract, but its reality was staggering. Iowa farm girls were outproducing the steel giants of Germany's Krupp factories and the entire industrial base of the Japanese Empire combined. But this victory was bought with a currency that didn't appear on any balance sheet: the health and youth of 15,000 women. The cost was written in the scars on Dorothy's hands and the permanent ringing in her ears from the unrelenting metallic thunder. In July, the factory floor hit a suffocating 104 degrees. Mary Kowalski, the girl whose brother was in Sicily, collapsed at her station, her skin pale and slick with sweat. When she was revived with salt tablets and cold water at the medical bay, the supervisor ordered her to go home. Mary looked him in the eye and refused. "My brother is in the mud," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not leaving." Within 90 minutes, she was back at her press. No one left, not for injury, not for exhaustion, because in Building 114, leaving meant someone else had to carry your burden, and everyone was already at the breaking point. Behind the women stood the ghosts of the maintenance crew, led by Howard Lumpke. Howard didn't live in a house anymore. He lived on a canvas cot in the grease-stained maintenance bay. He worked 18-hour shifts, his hands permanently wrapped in bandages where cold metal had torn his skin or hot oil had scalded him. The machines were running far beyond their rated capacity. Bearings wore out in days instead of years, and steel dies cracked under the relentless pressure. Whenever a press failed, Howard was there within 3 minutes, tools already in hand, welding patches onto broken parts to keep the lead flowing. One night at 2 a.m., Dorothy found him staring at a disassembled loader, his eyes bloodshot and vacant. When he looked up, he didn't talk about blueprints or quotas. He simply whispered, "I keep thinking about how many people are alive tonight because this machine didn't break." That was the secret fuel of the Des Moines plant. It wasn't coal or electricity. It was a shared, terrifying purpose. By the end of 1944, they had produced over 5 billion rounds. Dorothy's station had moved to the armor-piercing line for the Pacific Theater, where the stakes were even higher. She had become a master of the machine, her body so synchronized with the rhythm that she no longer loaded ammunition. She fed the very breath of the Allied advance. The summer of 1944 brought a heat that turned Building 114 into a literal furnace, with temperatures inside reaching a staggering 110 degrees. But the heat of the climate was nothing compared to the heat of the mission. In June, the news of D-Day, the massive Allied invasion of Normandy, filtered down the chain of command. The women knew, through classified whispers and official bulletins, that the boys hitting those beaches were carrying the very ammunition loaded in Des Moines. Dorothy's bullets were crossing the English Channel in the belts of machine gunners and the magazines of infantrymen. The pride she felt was secondary to a crushing sense of responsibility. In August, a massive shipment of raw brass arrived from a new supplier. On paper, the specifications were perfect. Technically, they fell within the allowed tolerance. But the moment Dorothy touched the first casing, she felt a microscopic flaw. The bases were 0.002 inches too thick. To a machine, it was negligible. To a bureaucrat, it was a pass. But to Dorothy's fingers, nerves refined by millions of repetitions, it felt like a catastrophe. The rounds seated harder. The crimping was uneven by a fraction of a degree. She knew what this meant. At a distance of 500 yards, accuracy would drop by 2%. She did the unthinkable. She walked to the plant manager's office and demanded the entire batch be rejected. William Hartley looked at the numbers. Rejecting the batch meant losing 3 full days of production, 27 million rounds. The War Department was screaming for supply. "It's within tolerance, Dorothy," he said, his voice weary. Dorothy didn't blink. She thought of Robert Hale and the 11-minute dogfight. "If 64 of his rounds had been 2% less accurate," she replied, "he wouldn't have made it home." The silence in the office was deafening. Hartley looked at the farm girl from Iowa and saw the same iron resolve that was currently breaking the Atlantic Wall. He approved the rejection. For 3 days, the high-speed lines stood silent, a hollow ache in the heart of the plant. When the new, perfect brass arrived 4 days later, the women worked double shifts to make up every lost second. They'd rather faint from the heat than send a single, suboptimal round to the front. Because in Des Moines, they didn't just make bullets, they made promises. And a promise was either kept perfectly or it wasn't kept at all. On August 15th, 1945, the world changed forever. At exactly 11 a.m., the voice over the loudspeaker in Building 114 didn't announce a new quota or a power failure. It simply said, "Cease production. Japan has surrendered." In an instant, the machines that had thundered for 3 years and 3 months fell silent. Dorothy stood at her press, her hands still hovering over the brass, and for the first time, the absence of noise felt like a physical blow. She looked around at 5,000 women, standing motionless, oil-stained and exhausted. No one cheered. No one screamed. They simply stood in the hollow silence, staring at the machines that had become their lives. Then, a slow, rhythmic clapping began. The same heavy, somber applause they had given Robert Hale's letter. It lasted for 11 minutes. Then, they simply walked out. Dorothy left the plant on August 16th, carrying the same cloth suitcase she had arrived with. She weighed 98 pounds. Her hearing was permanently damaged, and her hands were a map of scars from burns and acid. She boarded the bus back to the farm, watching the Iowa cornfields roll by in straight, indifferent lines, as if the world hadn't almost ended and been saved. She had loaded 7.3 million bullets. She had worked 6,200 hours. And yet, when she reached her porch, she didn't ask for a medal. She simply asked if the cows had been milked. The Des Moines Ordnance Plant was dismantled by 1946. The buildings were torn down, the machines sold for scrap, and the secrets buried under new layers of topsoil. The 15,000 women returned to their quiet lives, becoming mothers, wives, and neighbors. Their names were never written in history books. Their faces never appeared on monuments. But in 1947, a military audit revealed a staggering truth. 68% of all small arms ammunition fired by American forces in World War II had been produced in Des Moines. 11.6 billion rounds. 11 billion reasons someone's father, brother, or son came home. Dorothy Erickson lived until 1998. Her obituary spoke of her as a farm wife and a devoted church member. It said nothing of the war. But somewhere in a dusty archive in Washington, there is a production log from Line 7, Station 14. Next to employee number 3847, a supervisor's hand had scribbled in faded pencil, 7.3 million rounds. 0 defects. That was her legacy. She didn't just make bullets. She made a shield for civilization. The machines are gone, but as long as a single heart beats because of a bullet that didn't fail, Dorothy and the farm girls of Iowa live on.